Hi, welcome to the Mohua show. My name is Mohua Chinnappa and I am an author, entrepreneur and ex-housewife. This podcast is about everything from business to technology to arts to lifestyle, but done and spoken ईमानदारी से. Hi, in this episode we have with us Dr. Khagesh Gautam, an advocate, a highly accomplished lawyer, law professor and advocate for cannabis decriminalization. With a wealth of experience in criminal investigation, criminal evidence, constitutional law and more, Dr. Gautam brings a unique perspective to the legal field. He's not only a respected professor at Jindal Global Law School, where he teaches courses on criminal procedure, evidence and constitutional law, but also an experienced trial and appellate lawyer who has appeared before the Supreme Court of India and handles various other legal matters. Dr. Gautam is also a prolific author with 2 books and numerous articles in prestigious legal journals to his name. He's been recognized as an upcoming jurist and has even been invited to teach as a visiting professor at universities in China and Hawaii. So for me and for our show, we are very honored to have him with us today to discuss his views on decriminalization of cannabis, which is such a sticky subject. What inspired you to write Cannabis Indica, Perception versus Potential? Tell me, Khagesh.
Thank you, Mohua, for having me and for this very generous introduction. What inspired me to do this work was actually the work that I started in 2019 towards my PhD work in Indiana University in Bloomington. What happened was very surprising. My initial project, of which this book is a part of, is actually a project that focuses on comprehensive criminal justice reform in India and cannabis decriminalization, or rather re-legalization of cannabis, because it's very important to note that before the year 1985, when the 8th Lok Sabha enacted the NDPS Act, cannabis was in fact legal in India. Trade in cannabis was permitted upon license by state governments. Furthermore, it is important to note that this trade has been carrying on since before independence, because the constitution itself makes a reference to the phrase used to the constitution is Indian hemp. In the book, I established that Indian hemp and cannabis indica, or as section 2 subsection 4 of the NDPS Act says, all plants of the genus cannabis, they are actually one and the same thing. And Indian law has been using the phrase hemp or Indian hemp and cannabis synonymously since the year 1894. So that's one thing that I discovered. The other thing that really motivated me to do this work was my doctoral work is in the field of custodial confessions and presents a psychological examination of the same. While doing this research, I discovered that a custodial setting where suspects are custodially interrogated is a setting which is naturally prone to stress and anxiety. Furthermore, I discovered that states of stress and anxiety that are created in an artificial setting, in a custodial interrogation room, are not very conducive to revelation of truth, if you will. A person who's suffering from what, for instance, the DSM volume 4 for DSM is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. It's considered the Bible of modern psychiatry and psychology. According to DSM volume 4, there is a psychological condition called generalized anxiety disorder, and that disorder makes people extremely alert, hyper aware and hyper alert. Now, the point is that somebody who is experiencing anxiety will be extremely alert, and that's not a state in which they'll be conducive to tell the truth to the interrogating officer. So that contradiction then led me to the discovery that cannabis use has been reported as a great reliever of stress and anxiety. While then doing research for the book, I spoke with a lot of people who have consumed not only cannabis but other psychedelic substances such as psilocybin. And I was in the US, so I was able to speak to some people who had experimented with LSD as well. And I brought all this to bear. And lastly, when I realized that in the year 1969, 2 very contradictory things happened globally, and I'll stop at that. In the year 1969, the British Parliament, House of Lords, came up with a very interesting report. The name of that report is the Wooten Commission report, in which, on a practical reading of the report, all traditional charges that are laid out against cannabis or any type of psychedelic use have been debunked. It has been clearly laid down that it's a stress reliever. It's nothing distinct from alcohol. This is the finding in UK. The US Supreme Court, however, in the year 1969, overturned the conviction of a very famous Harvard psychologist, Dr. Timothy Leary. Dr. Timothy Leary is a very controversial name in the area of law and psychedelics, but he was experimenting with LSD and psilocybin even, and it was the experiments were being done under the protection and the support of Harvard University until it was disclosed that some rules were not followed, and Dr. Leary was unceremoniously removed from his office in the university. Nevertheless, in the year 1969, his conviction under a law called the Marijuana Prohibition Act of 1937 was overturned by the US Supreme Court. 2 years thereafter, the Americans enacted Controlled Substances Act, completely prohibiting cannabis and any other type of psychedelics. In India, the same thing was done in 1985. There is a whole body of evidence that shows that cannabis has extremely high medical potential that probably Western science isn't completely aware of yet. Criminalization of cannabis, which is essentially a healing herb, in light of all this evidence, pointed out a very contradictory position to me. And for a long time, I dealt with it internally, but after a while, I just couldn't bear with it. So I decided to write about it, and out came this book.
So it's very interesting because cannabis is viewed as evil that a person should not have, just how alcohol is. And alcohol is very openly sold for people all across. Now, for many of our listeners, who may have absolutely differing views about the usage of the Indian hemp or the cannabis, what is the potential medical benefits of cannabis indica strains? And has the medical fraternity really accepted it? Do you think that there would be acceptance for this?
Well, there would be acceptance for this, of that I have no doubt, because more and more, the thing is, the medicinal potential of this herb is being revealed. I'll give you an example. There is an entire list of medical conditions, the treatment of which is permitted by use of cannabis. I'll give you an example. And there is actually a list of 40 states in the US, but I'm citing some famous examples. So one famous example is Colorado in India, in legal communities and in the community that is familiar with the research on law and psychedelics. They are aware that cannabis has been legalized in Canada and in the state of Colorado. So for the treatment of cancer, glaucoma, even HIV, severe pain, that is chronic pain, nausea, seizures. Then you have psychological conditions where the research is upcoming, but you have the potential of cannabis to be able to manage PTSD, clinical depression, specifically dysthymia. Research with my students and working with my students, we have discovered that some people who are suffering with the ADHD or ADD have also reported healing and therapeutic benefits that they have obtained. And some studies have now started pointing out towards cannabis being potentially used as a sports medicine, because what we have discovered is that, as if you think of it as a sports medicine, in sports, those drugs are prohibited that enhance the performance of the athlete. However, cannabis, when you consider the neuropsychological effects of the drug or of the plant on the nervous system and on the body, it is the opposite of a performance enhancer. So you have a situation where not only for the treatment of medical conditions, but also for managing routine pain, cannabis and cannabis-based medicine is now being recognized more and more therapeutically. One thing I'd like to add also to this, Mohua, is that in India, it is widely accepted that cannabis is a prohibited substance, an addictive substance, and a dangerous substance because it is prohibited by the NDPS Act. However, if we go online and run just a regular search, regular Google search for medicinal cannabis industry in India, we'll be able to see there are many startups and established players as well. The Drugs and Cosmetics Act in India actually allows cannabis to be used as medicine. It lists cannabis as a medicine in Schedule E1 of the drug rules. So, therefore, the biggest myth is that it can't be used for any medicinal purposes, and B, it is not actually being used for any medicinal purposes in India. The truth, however, is, and which is easily disclosed on a bare Google search, is that it's the opposite. It has medical potential. The medical potential has been known since the year 1894. It has been repeatedly established in studies that have been published since the year 1894, a total of seven at least. And in India, Ayurvedic doctors and essentially ISM practitioners who practice the Indian system of medicine, are allowed to prescribe cannabis as medicine. They are prescribing this, and this is all done within the cover of law. So the fact is, cannabis is a medicine. Sciences have known this. Historically, this has been known. And in India, perhaps the awareness lacks. And of course, podcasts like this do help in spreading awareness. I've noticed all this in my book, by the way.
In 2016, Uttarakhand became the first Indian state to permit large-scale commercial cultivation of industrial hemp. So the license was awarded to the Indian Industrial Hemp Association, IIHA, to plant cannabis on 1,000 hectares. So obviously there is conversation and we are going back. But let's just discuss a little about your experience in teaching law and psychedelics and the impact it has had on your students, because the understanding of the subject of psychedelics is it's a very shaky ground. I mean, I'm a parent myself, and I'm not too sure as to how I would be able to talk to a child on psychedelics, because, as children, they may not be responsible about the usage of any sort of psychedelics or drug related conversations around their college. So
I agree with the view that you have presented. It's extremely difficult as it is to talk about psychedelics or psychotropics or mind altering substances generally, because most of the population does not consume these substances. If somebody has had a chance to consume them medicinally, they know the effect that they have on the mind. And it's, of course, you are a parent, and I meet with several parents, and I totally agree. And I share the point of view that these are, dangerous might not be the right word, but they're risky. And as responsible members of society, we have every reason and every obligation to protect our youth from falling into addiction and other risky behavior. So I share. But the more I think about it, the more I come to the conclusion that the only way to deal with the problem is to look the problem right in the face. If we want to protect our youth from the side effects of these substances, we owe it to our youth then to study them and to understand what exactly happens. Now, speaking with the students, I have realized, so that's one side. The other side is the students, the youth. The youth are adventurous, they like experimenting, and of course we don't want to kill that spirit, because that's what propels progress in our society. But of course it's a double-edged sword. Speaking with my students, I have found that students generally, and youth generally, not students but youth generally, because I do speak about this not only with my students but also with my fellow faculty members, with fellow members at the bar, judges, and such law enforcement officials I've spoken with, and in my own family, I have had chance to have detailed conversations. So my experience is that the youth does not really know how to talk about these things. B, they do not know with whom they should talk about. So if we look at the problem from those two angles, A, we need to give our youth a vocabulary in which they could intelligently talk about these issues. And the book does that. Several of my students have professed, and I have no reason to doubt that they are teetotalers. And yet, some of the most insightful research that my students have presented to me has come from those who have zero experience with any type of psychedelic or mind-altering substances, not even coffee in certain cases. So that's very interesting to note. Students, youth, when given a vocabulary, and a way to talk about these issues are able to engage with them effectively. They want to engage with them. And just because they want to engage with the issues of law and psychedelics is no indication of their propensity to consume those substances. That's a very important thing that we, as sort of so to speak, elders in this, I'm not very old myself, but as elders in the society, this is something that we have to be sensitive to. Second, to whom they should, to whom do they go to? This also I have seen has been a bit of an issue. Therefore, I think the most important contribution of the course that I'm teaching in the university in the coming semester, Law and Psychedelics, and the book Cannabis Indica Perception versus Potential, is one of the books that we're using in the course. The most important contribution that I have seen, and I've been doing this for a year and a half now, is that students get a safe space in which they know they will not be judged, and whatever they want to talk about, they can openly discuss. I have seen that this particular thing has had a lot of therapeutic effect on the students, and personally, it has benefited the research because it allows us to get a clear look at the manner in which the consumption of these substances affects the mind, the thinking patterns, the behavioral patterns, as well as the body. So those are the contributions that I've seen. I hope that answers the question.
Yes. Khagesh, it's very interesting because you are in the field of law. But do you think the Indian government's current stance on cannabis compares to other jurisdictions? And in many places, many people feel that sometimes the law fails us in some spaces. Tell me your opinion about the government's current stance on this.
Mahua, I think that's a very important question. And a bit of it I have also addressed in the third part of chapter 5. I think the government's stand can be looked at very objectively from a few legal developments. One of those I've discussed in the book is an amendment that was done in the NDPS Act in the year 2014, which basically enjoins the government to make sure that whatever substances are prohibited under the NDPS Act are available for medicinal and scientific research. If you look at this particular amendment in light of the Drugs and Cosmetics Act rules, Schedule E1, specifically the fact that cannabis sativa, cannabis indica, etc., they are all mentioned there as medicinal healing herbs. I think the government has put itself in a peculiar position where they must do all that they can to promote at least the medicinal cannabis industry. That's number one. Number two, another important development that is currently underway is the enactment of a new Drugs and Cosmetics Act, which will replace the old law. I have examined that law without going into too much detail. I think there is a lot of scope for improvement. And I think that if the government are sensitive to their already proclaimed position in Parliament, I think a lot of productive progress can be made in the enactment of this new law. Recently, it has been pointed out in the news that the Indian government has supported the removal of cannabis from, I believe, Schedule 4 of the 1961 United Nations Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs. I think that's a very welcome move, but I think that leaves much to be desired. As of now, as of today, cannabis and cannabis resin continue to be mentioned in Schedule 1 of the 1961 Single Convention. Schedule 1 of that convention is a list of all those substances that have no known medicinal potential. Similarly, in Schedule 1 of the 1971 United States Congress enacted Controlled Substances Act, there is the same legal position, and this is the legal position under the 1985 Indian Parliament enacted NDPS Act. I think the important provision is Section 20 of the NDPS Act. I think if the government have accepted, which is clear in our legal proclamations, that we as a nation and as a nation of laws do accept the premise that cannabis is indeed a medicinal healing herb, and if we do indeed accept the premise that historically, at least in India, it has been known that cannabis is a medicinal healing herb, then we have to do away with this great inconsistency that comes about in our NDPS Act Section 20 that prohibits criminally even the consumption of cannabis. Consumption of cannabis is specifically allowed in our Indian laws by the Drugs and Cosmetics Act. So we need to seriously redraft that law. I think the government will eventually come to this conclusion, or I think eventually the courts will realize that there is this great inconsistency in either way. In future, I do see this resolving itself. It's just a matter of time, the way I see it. It's not a matter of hope.
I really love this entire optimism that you have. I have met people who have told me about how they've had, they've healed very, very terminal diseases with just the usage of cannabis. Of course, they don't like to come out and talk too much about it for being misunderstood. As a law professor, how do you think the legal profession can play a role in shaping the conversations around cannabis legalization? Because conversations is also about people who don't understand the old culture of bhang and ganja, and how bhang is actually consumed during Shivratri in India. So how do you think this conversation will change?
That's a difficult question to answer, but because it essentially allows us to imagine, think about what's going to happen in future. But it's an important question to deal with also. In my perception, Mahua, I see two things happening. One is I see that the bar council, especially young law students and lawyers, are going to play a huge role in this societal transformation, if you will. But the first step is awareness, and awareness will come on two fronts. I think as people become aware of the issue, as people read this book, as other books are written, newspaper articles, etc., happen, people will start realizing the medicinal potential, and the entire body of those citizens who are closeted right now. And I do not know what other phrase I should use, because the phrase closeted is exactly right. We do have a lot of closeted cannabis consumers in India. I think a lot of them, my research, I think, to my mind, not beyond reasonable doubt, but I have very strong reason to assume, on the basis of data that we have collected with the help of my students, that there are this closeted community of cannabis consumers, which is very open amongst themselves, are actually consciously or subconsciously consuming it for medicinal purposes. We need to make sure that this community of citizens is given a safe space where they can come out, where if they are truly dependent on the substance, they can talk to therapists about it, they can deal their way through it. And we also need to figure out what are the medicinal underlying conditions for which they are consuming it. So I think I think the more we do away with the taboo that is associated with it, the more awareness will follow. And on that point, the taboo will go away. The more we realize that the consumption of, for instance, you correctly mentioned bhang, which is cannabis consumed in a shake or in a liquid, in an edible form, if you will. So we have to first realize that the phenomenon of consuming edibles, as it is known in the West, is actually quite indigenous to us. The Indian Hemp Drugs Commission report of 1894 mentions the preparation of sweetmeats, if you will, mithais, that use bhang and cannabis oils and extracts, etc. So that's one. Secondly, we have to realize that the use of cannabis, this is very sensitive, and it's very important to note that the use of cannabis has been associated with worship, with the worship of Shiva, Lord Shiva particularly, but there are instances of it being used for worship of other gods. The way I look at it, I examine, this is called entheogenic use, and a very famous American scholar, Professor Houston Smith, who was working with Professor Dr. Timothy Leary for a while, he wrote a very famous book, and a lot of other research that he has done tends to show that there is a connection of some sort between what is termed as a genuine religious experience and entheogenic use, which is not limited to cannabis itself. So the fact that, and very importantly, I've discussed this in detail in the book, the Yoga Sutras, book 4, verse 1, do mention that one of the accepted ways of attaining a very highly concentrated state that leads to samadhi, that's the eighth limb of the Ashtanga Yoga Sutra. The step is samadhi. What leads to that state is meditation and consumption of certain herbs is understood to be conducive to meditation. And I've discussed it in the book that cannabis is one of those herbs. So there is a connection there that we do have to study and very carefully examine. And I think once we do that, we do realize that there are constitutional arguments against cannabis. This is restricted just to cannabis, by the way, against criminalization of cannabis. One is an argument based on Article 21. Article 21 of the Constitution, and today, on the day of the recording, since it is the Republic Day, I think it's fair to mention the Constitution. Article 21 protects the right of life and personal liberty. That has been interpreted by the Supreme Court to mean the right includes the right to exist with personal dignity. On that, there is no dispute. Now, if I have a constitutional right to exist with dignity, and if pain and dignity are antithetical, if there is nothing dignified in pain, then is it not my fundamental right to seek ways in which my pain can be managed or alleviated? And if it is, then I do have a fundamental right to be aware, to be prescribed, at least to be able to go to a physician and seek the prescription of this plant as medicine. That's number one. And number two, there is perhaps an argument that needs to be developed. If we closely look at the text and the doctrine of Article 25 and 26, which talk about fundamental protection of religious freedoms, then there seems to be a case that if, say, for instance, a hypothetical situation where a saint or a sadhu establishes a religious premises and establishes an idol, so now the land actually belongs to the idol. This is traditional Hindu law. Now, if the lands of that akhada or that temple, etc., if a certain part of that land is used to cultivate cannabis, which is then offered to the Lord, the Shivalingam, as an offering, then act is actually violative of the NDPS Act Section 20. But is that not an act that is worthy of being immunified, of being protected from unnecessary state intrusion on the grounds that the land per Article 26 belongs to the establishment and the cultivation of this is for an essential religious purpose, which is the worship of the installed deity or the image thereof? So those are two of the key arguments that my students and I are working on very furiously these days. We'll see in which direction this takes us.
In 1841, William Brooke O'Shaughnessy introduced cannabis into Western medicine after living in India. He wrote of many therapeutic uses of cannabis, including a case where cannabis stopped convulsions in a child. But while we're saying all of this, we also know that, cannabis usage and the decriminalization that you are talking about, I don't know whether India is ready, for it just as yet. As much as, cannabis has been prevalent from times immemorial, especially in a place like India where it's consumed in the form of ganja or bhang. Cannabis can be used in several forms. It's often also smoked as a dry, shredded green and brown mixes of flowers, stems, seeds, and leaf. There is a conversation that says that someone can become as addicted that they can be with alcohol and tobacco. A person dependent on cannabis can also have withdrawal symptoms, and it can get very devastating for a youngster who may not be able to understand the symbiotic relationship, between siddhi and the usage of cannabis. So before I end this episode, just for my listeners, I would like to read out one part from your book for people who are interested in picking up this book. And I'm sure there are lots and lots of people who would love to read about this. I personally believe that there is a huge market now for hemp companies where there's food, there is cosmetics, and there is anti-anxiety oils that's available. And India, as we're talking about becoming more and more Indian and embracing our roots, this is a humongous part of our culture. Just to talk a little bit about Cannabis Indica, Perception versus Potential is a comprehensive and insightful book that delves into the historical and legal status of the cannabis plant in India, written by Dr. Khagesh Gautam. And I think when you pick up this book presents compelling arguments for the legalization of the plant, supported by extensive research and academic documentation, so that the benefits offered by the plant can be fully realized in a regulated environment. Thank you, Khagesh, for this absolutely wonderful interview today. I am so charged because this is so amazing to see. I can feel the passion from your side, and I really hope and wish you luck in all the experiment and all the work that you're doing with the students, so that this sees the light of the day and we start recognizing the benefits of the cannabis plant. Thank you for being on today's episode.
Thank you so much, Mohua. If I may just add, we need all the help and support, so we thank you for your wishes. We do plan to continue this work. Thank you so much for having me. I hope this podcast results in some awareness, something exactly my students and I want for this project. So thank you so much for having us once again.
Thank you. To you, our dearest listeners, you can find us on your favorite streaming services, Spotify, Amazon Music, Apple Podcast, and of course on all other major streaming services. With loads of love, we are The Mohua Show, where we talk ईमानदारी से.